Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Today, we are stepping into a space that is both exciting and challenging. What happens when realist approaches meet other research traditions, disciplines, and ways of knowing? Realist approaches are often described as useful for working with complexity. They help us ask what works, for whom, in what context, and why. But interdisciplinary research brings its own kind of complexity. Different fields often come with different assumptions about evidence, causation, knowledge, and even truth itself. And when realist approaches are brought together with indigenous methodologies, implementation science, global health governance, and culturally grounded ways of knowing, the work can become relational, epistemological, and deeply political. To explore this, I am joined by Dr. Kenneth Yakubu, whose work sits at the intersection of health systems, global health governance, implementation research, health equity, and realist thinking. His research focuses on understanding and improving governance across health and social systems, supporting multicultural communities, and evaluating complex interventions aimed at advancing equity. In this conversation, we will explore what it really means to navigate competing perspectives when realist approaches are combined with other disciplines and traditions. We will talk about Yakubu's experience leading the development of a realist protocol that brought together indigenous methodologies, implementation science, and other ways of thinking, a process that took nearly 2 years to reach shared agreement. We will unpack where the tensions emerge, what made alignment difficult, and how researchers can work across different assumptions without flattening, absorbing, or privileging one tradition over another. So without further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome you to the podcast, Yakubu. Good afternoon from Sydney. How are you?
I'm well, Alejandro, and nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for coming in and spending some time here at the Realist Lens, because I know how much work you've put into not only the research and the work that you do, but into the protocol that we're going to be speaking about, and some of the conversations and reflections that have come from that with such an interdisciplinary team with so many people and so many minds. And I'm sure there's going to be a fantastic opportunity to just share a bit about that experience. But just before we go into that, would you mind just sharing a little bit of a quick background on yourself, who you are, and your current role?
Sure. So my background is in family medicine. I trained as a family physician in Nigeria and practiced for a bit, as a consultant family physician and decided that, hey, I really did want to pursue a bit more of the academic side of things. So that took me through doing a master's in philosophy of family medicine at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, and then eventually coming over to Australia to do my PhD. That was global health focused. And again, that was also interdisciplinary, sitting across health systems, human rights law, and public health. Perhaps that's where I started cutting a bit of my teeth in interdisciplinary research. My current role also is interdisciplinary. I'm sitting across a health systems implementation research for health equity program and our Indigenous program at the George Institute for Global Health, which you may already know, Alejandro. It's an independent medical research institute based in Sydney, Australia. And so half of my time is in that research role, and the other half of my time is in research partnerships, really thinking about equitable, culturally grounded research partnerships and how the organization does that, across African context. So yeah, that's been my current role and experience.
I love that, Jaku. Thank you so much for sharing that, and so exciting. I guess that's one of the exciting things in that kind of role is that no one day is the same. When you work with so many
No,
different people and so many different, you know, disciplines and so many different countries and ideas, there's always going to be something new to learn, something new to develop, and also a lot of innovation, right? You're going to have a lot of opportunities to see how that all develops and how we can build these things and use the strengths of approaches to help us answer complex questions, because of course
mhm,
complex questions and complex problems need a little bit of thinking to
yeah.
move beyond. You just can't have a simple solution, of course.
Mhm.
So I mean, you've already mentioned all the work that you do in so many different areas around global health governance, implementation research, and of course, realist approaches, which is one of the areas that really interests you as well. Adding to that, you're also engaging with indigenous and culturally grounded methodologies, so a lot of different strands coming together. So, how has your training across all these different strands, paradigms, disciplines shaped the way you approach complex health systems research today?
No, thanks, Alejandro. That's a good question. I think I feel blessed to have started or chosen a postgraduate medical training in family medicine because I think that laid the foundation for a lot of ways that I think now. As a family physician, I'm trained to see the person and not the disease. And so it's very difficult for me to call people cases. Very early on, I learned to say people living with XYZ. And I do remember that a lot of what was exciting about coming to the clinic was that I could see the same condition, but yet the experiences would be so different. So very early on as a family medicine registrar, I learned to appreciate context. I could be prescribing the same thing, but the application will differ across family settings, individuals, cultural groups, religious groups. And so that really prepared me for engaging with context. It also prepared me for engaging with complexity that some of my, consultations could run an hour because I had to sort of tease out what was medical, what was cultural, and all of that has to come in my management plan. So I'm grateful that my postgraduate clinical degree was in family medicine. And that gave me a lot of insight into how context and complexity, but much more that research should serve people and research should be people-centered and not the other way around. And the second thing really is also that my PhD also challenged me in a way, that I didn't think it would. I was interacting with human rights law. Nothing prepared me, you know, as a doctor that has done all my thinking as a clinician and to start grappling with societal problems from a human rights perspective and human rights as codified in legal systems and trying to articulate and express myself in that language was what I did was just to stay at the intersection of what I can speak the legal lingo, but I can express what complexity means as a clinician and try to define a language that helps me articulate what I'm trying to express, But I think I started to understand what contestations mean, and confrontations and how that is framed both formally and informally. And I think my PhD really helped me unpack that. And to see what epidemiology or population health or public health is good for and not good for. And it did open me up, to the leanings of how you can be responsive to population health needs and what you might describe as social medicine. And I think that those are two things that I look at that has shaped the way that I approach research. And towards the later part of my research experience, just beginning to realize that research cannot be divorced, from people's culture and historical backgrounds and beginning to realize the need, to take a more decolonial and localized approach while still trying to stay connected, to the global. So I will point to those two, parts of my training as key contributors to how I think and do research at the moment.
Fascinating, Yakubu. Thank you so much. And it's always so interesting when you hear someone's background experiences, ideas, trainings, and then it really explains how you come across the experience and ideas and the decisions that we make as researchers, right? And you said something really important, which is language matters, which I completely agree about the importance of language in many cases. So not only for, of course, as a tool for communication, but as a way of interpreting, as a way of analyzing, and as a way of being equitable and as a way of being respectful to so many different thoughts and ideas. So language does matter. You even mentioned around people-centered, research and people-centered care, which just in the International Conference for Integrated Care in Birmingham that was just last month, they were talking even going further around people shaped and going further into that lived experience and the role of lived experience, which I think is fascinating. And actually, I just want to say, I mean, you've mentioned context, you've mentioned complexity, you've mentioned adjudication between explanations. It sounds like you're thinking like a realist.
When I think more about realism as, as a philosophy, as a method theory, I'm becoming more and more convinced that they are more realists than we want to admit. Even people who do not want to call themselves realists, there's a lot of realist thinking going on in a lot of other things that will not, traditionally be called realism. So yeah, you can call me a realist.
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I do joke about this, and I say two things to people, which is one, which is in our day-to-day lives, we're always saying things like, "Oh, in theory that should work," or "Oh, it depends on the context. It's not the same." So there's a lot of the things that we do in our day-to-day lives which actually are in a way realist thinking. It's a very old way of thinking in a way, and. And then what you mention as well, I'm just really interested to hear about how you came across realist because of course that's one of the areas that you have been more
Mm,
involved in over the past few years. So how did you come across realist approaches?
No, that's that's a good question, Alejandro. So my research was really answering an impossible question: developing a sustainable global health workforce in the light of ongoing migration, as you would know, Alejandro, about how these things happen. And when I started the PhD, one thing I told myself, I wasn't going to do push pull. What are the push and pull factors? That's not what I was going to do. I wasn't cut out for that. I wanted to understand what was happening. Not just that it happened, and not determinants, not barriers, not facilitators. I wanted the story, around why this has been perpetuating itself, because it did seem to me that the issues that were being discussed had taken a life of its own and was perpetuating itself. And at the time, I didn't call it emergence, but that's, in retrospect now, that's what I realized. And I remember one of my supervision meetings, I expressed my frustration with some of the research methods that were more epidemiological leaning, and seemed to, have a bit of that positivist approach. I was like, I'm not satisfied with this, and a co-supervisor, Professor David Perry, was like, hey, you may want to talk, to so and so person about realist methodologies. It seems like that's what really you're after. And so he directed me to talk to now Professor Shea Bimbola. And I was like, hey, this is what I want to do. And I was like, yeah, you can do that using a realist methodology. And that's how I took what should have been a 6 months lean, but ended up a 2 year lean of doing a realist review, and the frustrations where the whole of the supervision team did not know what I was doing. So I had to teach both myself and my supervision team what exactly I was doing. And so I think that for me was my entry point into realism. So it was now chasing after every webinar, buying Ray Parsons' books, and just eating as much as I can. The second thing that happened to me was when I joined one of Justin Jagosh's training sessions, and he had us present on our research topics. And while a lot of the other presentations were going out, they seemed very clean, neat, within some sort of health systems type of thinking. Whereas my research topic was sounding more macro, societal, cross-country, and one of the reflections, he was like, hey, you seem to be thinking along the lines of critical realism than you are, because there's a strong value leaning that you have. It's very normative focused. It's societal leaning there. And he was the one that made me even realize there were different appeals and different flavors that I could take. And so I feel like I've been stumbling my way, discovering my path. Yeah, how is that for a description of?
I, th- I think that's fantastic because it's such a I think a lot of people, first of all, will relate to that they some sort, through a conversation or through reading something or through a book or through a paper, bump into this thing called realist and go, that that's what I'm looking for. That makes sense. But then, of course, it's one thing is the initial it makes sense, and then one thing's learning it and going through
Yeah.
the whole process and through the whole conversations and through the whole jargon. And it's interesting that you mentioned actually really, really nicely about those differences between, the Hawson and Tilly kind of,
Mm,
more scientific realism, you want to call it as such, and then the more critical realist approach and some of the nuances and differences between the two, but of course both extremely useful for the purposes of trying to understand and explain and going a little bit
mm,
deeper. And I guess that's from all your work and then learning about realist and all your training and all your interdisciplinary work, that's when it comes to you to think about the development of this realist protocol across disciplines,
yeah.
because what a feat, what a what a a very exciting but as well challenging project because you're looking at realist, indigenous methods, implementation science. And you mentioned off camera that it took nearly 2 years to reach agreement on the protocol and on the writing. So from your perspective, what were the core sources of tension or friction between these approaches? So what made alignment so challenging that it took 2 years to get to something that everyone in the team was satisfied with?
No, I'll provide a bit of a background so that at least our audience can know what I'm speaking to. The project is an evaluation of the Healthy Homes and Neighborhoods projects in Sydney. It's sponsored from a local health district in Sydney, and where the thinking is really that, hey, lots of families are doing it tough and falling through the cracks and not being able to make use of existing health and social services. And the sponsors then really thought very strongly that we can do more to support programs. So this became more of like the thinking was more of an integrated care initiatives, and bringing together different disciplines to provide services in a hub. So there was this hub and spoke type of appeal where, all services were coming into the hub to provide that, care navigation, care coordination type of service, and as well, community based outreaches and much more that I probably won't go into details now. So our job was to evaluate the program and to say, hey, not just is this working, how is it working, for whom is it working, and in what conditions. Now, on the team, people who are so experienced on Indigenous research methodologies, and like you've rightly mentioned, people who come with a very implementation focused type of leaning qualitative methods. The one I didn't mention is that the statisticians who are very committed to their numbers. And so there was a statistical analysis protocol being written separately. There was a health economics evaluation protocol being written separately. And when I took on the role, my job was to say, hey, here is the ethics approval. It's been approved. Here's this different pieces of thoughts. Go ahead, write up the protocol. And here was I, first of all, grappling to even understand. It felt like a complex intervention. Like there were just so many moving bits. So that's just really just getting my head around it. And of course, I must give a shout out to Dr. Ferdinand Mukumba, who had done some of the earliest work, on formulating the initial program theories with Professor Eastwood. And so, that for me was my first, struggle, just even trying to understand what exactly is happening. But the tension for me came with really understanding what is truth, for each of the people involved. And where even people found the realist methodology offensive, there was a bit of thinking that it had its leanings, in English philosophy, which at the time I did not know too much, but now I do know more that, it's not entirely so. But then the thinking really was that, hey, it has been popularized, from the people who have popularized it, come from an Anglo-Saxon background. And I got to really understand also that in an Indigenous context, research means much more than epistemological engagement, than just, talking about knowledge. It's about self-determination. It's about amplifying the voices of people. It's that, yes, you are doing an analysis, but the analysis cannot and should not replace the voices and the aspirations of the people. And from an Indigenous perspective, there's a lot of thinking that the researcher cannot obscure or, diminish visibility. And any method that would diminish visibility of the community voices, it's not really accepted. The second struggle was where for people who were more leaning to phenomenology and would want a narrative. So you would, instead of, if I tell people that the end of this process is going to be program theories, they'll say, hey, we're thinking you're going to give us the best quotes, that tells us what the experience is. And I say, yeah, we're starting from the experiences, but that's the starting point. We're going to dig from the experiences and work backwards. And so the expectations were different. So how am I going to meet the expectations of everybody on the team who is looking at a different end product? And I write the first protocol and people are saying, hey, it's not meeting my expectation. I don't see myself in that protocol. And I hear when someone tells you that this does not reflect the voices of my people, you're in really deep trouble because it becomes a political conversation that I'm not equipped to have. And so Yeah, I think for me, those were my tension points and those were my struggles. I did not have an answer. I was not prepared for that. I just knew that this was the right way to go and that was all. But how is your right different from the other person's right? And how do you have that that conversation? Nothing prepared me at the time for it. Yeah.
I mean, I could ask so many follow-up questions to that. It is so interesting what you're mentioning there. And I just want to comment a little bit more around those tensions that you're talking around truth and what truth means, particularly working interdisciplinary with so many different ideas and thoughts and trainings. As you mentioned really rightly, your training and your experiences have helped you look at the world at a different way and the problems that interest you. But then you have all these different people who have had also those experiences and thoughts. So when it comes to this concept of truth, particularly that you're mentioning at the start, and that tension of I don't identify myself here, and I don't do, and I don't, my voice is not being, or the voice of the people I represent is not being put forward. How do you deal with that in an equitable way? Because of course, a lot of the main things that you're talking around here is around health equity and the importance
Mm.
of being equitable to everyone in the team. But it seems like, as you say, with so many competing voices and priorities, that seems like a challenge.
Yeah, I think at the time I couldn't help but feel that equity started with me. And maybe this is not a right thing to say, it's not political correct, but I felt outnumbered. I felt at the time I was the only one who understood what I was saying. And so at the time, I think my priority was to say, hey, you all speak a language that you all understand. And I'm the only one speaking my language. So I'm going to prioritize trying to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. Just because I think the more you understand what I'm saying, the more you're going to come around. And that was my approach to saying, this is how we're going to arrive at what is fair, or what is equitable. Okay. And the more I did that, the more nobody was listening. The more I was distancing myself. And I realized that I needed to sit down and listen, to what are the concerns? And when you dig into the history of First Nations peoples, and I'm speaking from an Australian context, you will get to appreciate. And this is probably the same in other Indigenous contexts, that research has been a tool for oppression. And the scars are still there. The distrust is still there. When someone tells you, I've heard about this methodology before, but it doesn't really capture the needs of my people, I had to do a bit of research. And so for me, it was going back to say, am I the only one who has experienced this? Are there other people who have experienced this? And how have they navigated that? And coming back and borrowing their voices and borrowing their expressions to say, I hear you, okay? And it did take me a bit of a while to understand that the way to go about it was not speaking realist language louder and trying to shout everybody down, was that I needed to learn. So one of the books that helped me was Research as Ceremony. That it's an Indigenous research methodology book that a colleague advised that I get, and I got it, and I had to school myself in that. And just reminding myself about what the journey has been. And I think just being humble to say, hey, if this were to work, how would you see this work? And this iterative, cycles of putting it through and someone is saying no, and you're putting it through and you're hearing no, and you kind of say, okay, if you say no, 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 tell me how. I wasn't hearing the how. I just knew that it wasn't working. So I'll say persisting, I am persisting and knowing that it wasn't going to be entirely equitable, but we will get close to what is fair and what people feel comfortable with. Constantly coming to the conversation, not relying on hierarchy, to draw ranks and define, what is true. Showing that I was listening, schooling myself on what the fears and concerns were. Some of them I thought were probably not rightly placed, but again, without showing empathy and acknowledging those concerns, no conversation was going to happen. And just accepting that it was going to take time. It got to a point I stopped rushing. I stopped sending emails and saying it has to be by this time. I realized that this was a conversation we'll have to drag out. And yeah, I believe we got there at the end.
Yakubu, so many learnings I hear from the experience and from the thoughts, and a little bit of trial and error as well. Of we're going to this way, but eventually getting to a place that you feel after that time that you reach a harmonious agreement. And I guess that one of the two things that you mentioned, again from a realist perspective, that seem very useful in your learning and experience is one, of course, that iterative process of really
Mm,
speaking to people, engaging with lived experience researchers, stakeholders, and everyone as a, in a way, co-design and or co-production process to help reach those ideas, which of course are going to ensure that, as you say, reach as equitable as possible. But also one of the things that you mentioned that I think is so important, particularly in relation to what is truth or
mhm,
what is knowledge, is around the humble element, and how, of course, in realist, no theory is the perfect theory or explains
yeah,
everything,
mm,
and that, of course, is probably also a useful way to try and understand that our knowledge and our information is tentative, and those
mhm,
information that we're trying to develop and grow and evolve, so to speak, it may be, of course, adapted with all these different knowledge systems and ideas that may help us refine that even better at all these different stages. But of course, getting everything at once, from the start can be really useful, but very challenging. One of the things that you said that was really interesting is that the interdisciplinary work, of course, brings together fundamentally these different assumptions. And when you're combining realist approaches with other paradigms or ideas, there's one thing that you mentioned that was really interesting around, for example, the analysis not reducing the voice of those
mhm,
people or the voice of those paradigms, or of what's being, not only what's been listened but what's been heard, because it's very, sometimes what we say is, as you say, is not heard, and the most important thing is
mhm.
what's being heard and what's being seen, and that it's really representative of those voices. So I guess my question for you is, how do you navigate this competing approaches without privileging one over the others? Because, of course, one of the risks that you have here is like a conceptual drift where you start maybe at the start of your introduction of your methods saying one thing, and then by the end of your results with your analysis, there's a
Mhm.
slight misalignment because of all sorts of voices and things trying to come together. So how did you navigate those tensions without, of course, using the strengths of the approaches without diluting them?
Mm. No, that's conceptual drift is a big risk in this type of work. And when I look back at, previous versions of the protocol that we're discussing, I can see many instances where the work wasn't looking like, a realist informed or realist inspired work, and does look like a mishmash of sorts. But what really helped, me stay the course on what I understood to be true, but of course wanting to bring together and carry along and work with other voices, well, was just having someone on the side that understood what I needed to do or what I wanted to do. Who, yes, wasn't part of all, the navigating, just was independent and did not have any interest, whatsoever in whichever way, decisions were made, and just being able to have that safe space to have a conversation, and to think through what am I missing here, and I believe that I had both of that in both camps, both someone who knew realism and people who knew indigenous research methods and other methods, and just having people I could just trust to share what my frustrations were. And so that was really, really, really helpful. The other thing that I learned in the process was that my approach and my thinking at the time was that critical realism will provide the overarching mixed methods that will bring together what we're learning from the quantitative analysis, bring together what we're learning from the interviews, the economic analysis, and weave them through program theories, and if you look at my diagram, then you see it spelled out that everything was feeding into, and that diagram it felt so, it really was affronting. And people felt, no, don't do that. It just sort of feels like we're all coming down, bowing down, to critical realism. At the time, I didn't really know that that was the case, and it was such a big deal. But then someone taught me again about, research at the interface, which is more of an indigenous expressions of how you contend with different, bodies of knowledge. And it's for those who have done a lot of indigenous research methods, what it speaks to is that you can hold your truth. Both of you can hold your truth, but there is a place that you intentionally weave over. So yeah, the picture I have in my mind is like it's a weaving, and you can see the weaving happening at the fringes, and they stay distinct, but there is a place where you weave over, and it's a tension line. It's a place where it's not comfortable, but you stay there and you weave together. And what comes out of that may not entirely look like indigenous research methods, and may not entirely look like critical realism or quantitative methods, but it speaks to the tension that both of you have had, and have been able to express. But then you see the fringe still holds what you recognize as separate and distinct, and that it's okay, for those tension lines to weave over and to stay apart, as the case may be. And the protocol, when you start to read, it does not strike you at first that, hey, somebody with a critical realist leaning wrote this, because you see it coming from perhaps, a mixed methods appeal, respect for an indigenous voice. And then only towards the end, you begin to realize, in the middle, that this is where the watershed is. This is where the methods speak to each other. And so I will thank the person who taught me, the indigenous researcher who taught me about weaving as a research methodology and research at the interface, and using that to express, my, understandings of critical realism, and borrowing that as tools, to express, what I was doing. And yeah, that's how we were able to navigate. And I won't say there wasn't a conceptual drift. Of course, there was some conceptual drift, but the essence is there, and the voices are captured at the same time.
That is, again, so interesting, Yakubu. I could hear about this and your experiences all day, just to really understand, like, the things that can't be written in a way in the actual protocol or the paper, because of course you only see the final product, but it has gone through so much work and so much thinking and so much conversation and dialogue to get to that stage. And there's two things that came to mind as you were talking. One was that weaving. I'm not sure if it's a little bit like a Venn diagram, no? That you have like this thing in the middle.
Yeah.
That where are the points of, I mean, the points of harmony, It may not necessarily be a full agreement, but points of harmony, that there is some sort of alignment. And of course, then with each kind of the approaches, there may be some red lines that they go, no, if you say this or you say that, that's completely different. But this is where I think also innovation comes in, and not being scared of the opportunities that we have as a realist community with other approaches and disciplines, to see how we can indeed maybe combine this element to utilize the strengths of both, without diluting the key components of, reality, truth, knowledge, and other things, which again, it sounds great, but much difficult to do. But it is a great
Difficult in
conversation to
practice.
have at
Yeah.
another time as a more methodology conversation. But there is something that I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned earlier as well about, realists sometimes being offensive, which was really interesting, because of course realist has been used in so many disciplines, not only in health, of course, but in education. This has been used in all sorts of different disciplines to now develop as an approach, and in a way it's been seen as a bridge, but not always, from your experience, that it has been, taken as something that people have embraced from the start. That bridge and connection, as you say, critical realism being like the paradigm or the lens with which you're viewing the work, sometimes it hasn't been that bridge between people. So what does it actually take to build those bridges in practice, especially when working with some of those approaches grounded in indigenous or context specific ways of knowing? Because of course, initially you mentioned that it was the initial, lens as you were going to view this work. We're going to go through critical realist and your more realist philosophy. But hey, you got some pushback on that. So how did you manage that and how did you reach that harmonious bridge for realist and other approaches?
Yeah. Yeah. So you would know that, Alejandro, that where you go through the stages of a typical realist analysis, it does privilege your voice as a researcher. Yes, there are places where people can, give feedback on your theories and help you refine them, but a large chunk of it, you would have to do the heavy lifting, of describing, redescribing, abduction, retroduction, and that's one. So there is a part where we do talk about unpacking or opening the black box, but for some people, they see it as going into a black box where they don't understand what you're doing. Abduction? What are you abducting? Retroducing? How? I think one key frustration was seeing how just how the interviews were going to become program theories. It was just a mystery. No matter how much I explained it, people could not see the link between how is that evidence and how can I trust that evidence that has gone through a process that I don't understand. I don't understand when you say retroduction. If you say yanning and the way you analyze a yarn live in the heads of a lot of people, if you say interviews and doing a thematic analysis, people know what you're talking about. But when I say I'm going to take it through these stages of description and redescription and resolution and abduction and retroduction, I'd lost people. It seemed like I was waving a magic wand and evidence was coming out, and no no one trusted that process. So it's how did I earn the trust? One of the things I stopped doing was stop saying ontological depth or stratified reality or any of those jargons. I just stopped saying them. I stopped saying them and I started saying, this is how I'm going to do this, and then we're going to do it together. A huge suspicion that I had, especially, and a caution I had from my Indigenous research colleagues, were like, what theories are you using to redescribe the interviews? Are these theories capturing our histories? Are these theories capturing our cultures? Or are these theories still reifying the assumptions from other Eurocentric, cultures, which you'll be offending us? So when I came to that stage of abduction, that stage where I was redescribing, what I'd gotten from the transcript, I had to go to the Indigenous research group and say, are there theories that you trust that captures causation for you, that you can point me in the direction of? I showed them the components that are broken down into, this is how action is leading to outcome. I don't understand in the evil. I'm trying to trace the dots. Are there theories that can help me see the causal pattern there? And they were very generous. They shared with me theories that they use that captures their own ways of knowing and being. And I told them I'm going to use both, theories from mainstream research and the theories that you give me. And I used that for my process of abduction. I'm just trying as best as possible to keep a trail, So I was exposing them to the complexities and the just what was behind on the screen. My workbook, I gave them links and access to it. Of course I trust them, so they could see how my thinking was unfolding and where I was plugging in the theories that they had shared. And when I developed something, they saw the transcripts, they saw how I moved from the narrative to how I was searching for the structures, to how I was searching for the mechanisms, to how I was articulating that. And then I will come back and say, hey, see, this is the transcript on one side. These are my annotations. These are my notes. This is what I've defined by context. This is what I've defined by mechanism. And see how I brought every other thing together. How does that sound to you? So I try to reduce the work that they had to do, the mental load that they had to do. Some of my friends will say mental gymnastics, that they had to do, the loops and the hoops they had to go through, because it's cognitive heavy when you're doing a realist analysis. And my thinking was that if I can just make the work process simple and accessible, they can follow me on the journey. So they don't know everything I've done, but they can say, oh, yeah, I see where you had those blocks of transcripts and where you got from that to redescription, and I see how you've linked it to this theory we gave you. And yeah, I see the voice is not lost. I see how you've landed at your program theory. So program theories now became the buzzword, Yeah. And so that is one thing that we're able to, but of course, just try not to do it at once, just trying to allow for time. And they were very generous with their time. I really have to commend our Indigenous research group here at the Georgia Institute. They were very generous with their time. They kept on coming back to the table. Whatever they were uncomfortable with, they will push back on. I'll read it. I'll find different ways of expressing it. But of course, I didn't want to give up what I knew was true, but did my best to stay sensitive, to community needs as well.
I mean, I think if I had to summarize in 2 words, which is going to be a challenge, but let me have a go. That answer, one would be around accessibility. So how do you ensure that Realist becomes accessible to your audience? Because again, just because you're using big words that you only understand, that's not helping anyone. It's not helping the team. It's not helping the project because it's not. You can explain the same thing in a way that's accessible without losing its meaning. Absolutely. And the second one that I think it's so important is transparency. So
Yeah.
showcasing how you're thinking in a way that sometimes, as you say, can be quite deep and quite cognitive and quite thoughtful, which is of course one of the strengths, but also because a lot happens in the mind. They will go, where's the receipt? How do I know that our knowledge and our thoughts have got to where we are? And actually that accessibility and transparency, particularly with working with with large groups from interdisciplines to ensure that transparently you're all getting there with no hidden agendas. I think that appears as something that is quite useful. But one thing that are those 2 words, by the way, good to summarize that?
Yeah. You did. You made my work easier.
No, I just wanted to check if there was any others you could think of. But there's after 2 years, and I mean, in a way, this is a bit of a fallacy. This question, because this probably happens over time. There's not going to be one single point in time that there was a big light bulb moment that everyone was one day they woke up and everything was perfect. But was there any periods or turning points where things began to shift, where there was some mutual understanding in the protocol development process? What helped move the work forward at the critical junctures where there was this tensions? Was there any meetings or moments or periods where things seemed to progress? And if so, why do you think that was?
Yes. So I can look back at something that I know really started, to gain momentum then in the Indigenous research space, a lot around strength-based speak and avoiding a deficit discuss. And that was a separate conversation that started. And I asked myself, what can I learn from this process? And how can I change my language? Because people wanted to see that even if research was not fundamentally indigenous, how can it be respectful to indigenous ways of knowing and being? And so it now became very clear that there was an opportunity for me, to cash in there. And the third thing was that I got to learn more about operationalizing a knowledge interface from my indigenous research colleagues. And so what I did was to come up with a table that spoke the language of strength-based thinking. So it captured the thinking that my colleagues had then. There was a lot of push in the circles that I was involved in against the deficit discourse in public health. And that was something very important for my colleagues then. And showing how research, even if it is not indigenous focused or indigenous, must, also speak respectfully of people agency and capture them, their strength and capability. And so I now presented a table to our indigenous research colleagues. And on that table, it showed that each strand could speak truth, that if you were doing a quantitative research, you will come in and do the quantitative research and define what outcomes were. And I wasn't going to ask you to do the teacher, learner, realist interview thing. Go ahead. This is what I would like to learn. Transform that into a yarning guide, and let's do a yarn and let's not do a real. I wanted to do a realist interview in the strict sense of it. But my colleagues felt more comfortable about a yarn. And I was like, hey, what does a yarn? I don't know how to do a yarn. I'm probably not culturally, approved to do a yarn in the context that I'm speaking about. And we're like, hey, let's do a yarn. And they were very generous to take my realist interview schema and change that into a yarn, a schema for a yarn. There were instances where it remained as a semi-structured interview, and there were other instances where it remained as a realist interview. And so when you look at the table for a knowledge interface, you will just see everything plugged in. That, the person doing health economics knew where they were plugging in. The person doing their statistical, they knew where they were plugging in. And you will see the methodology for critical realism there. And people did not feel they were not heard. They felt like I was taking tools from them and using it, And I think for me, that was where I would say, and maybe my colleagues will have a different narrative to share, but for me, that was really the shifting point in the research, where I was now recognizing what was important, what was speaking to the needs at that time, parallel conversations that were speaking to research needs in the community, leveraging on that, to express what I wanted to do, but also respecting that researchers love autonomy and saying, how can this still be critical realism, but still, respect the autonomy of researchers to just plug in to your analysis plan. And at the end of the table, what I wrote was that, people are allowed to pursue their line of reasoning, and we will come at the place of convergence. And where there's divergence, we will hold that space, those tension lines, and appreciate each other. And there's no looking down on anyone, because you have different answers at the end, of the game. But I think that willingness to do that, meant people were happy to come back again because they knew their voices would be heard. And overall, I think that I will also have to give a lot of the credit to my boss, Associate Professor Ming Liu, who at the very beginning started setting the stage for family-centeredness and a vision for structural determinants of health. So that was a bit of it that, was also something that perhaps borrowed validity, borrowed credibility that I could draw on, and the respect that they have for her as well. And to say, hey, I think the guy is credible. Let's give him a chance. Yeah.
Yakubu, I think that one of the things that you and the team should really be credited on as well is creating the environment for those conversations to be possible, where disagreement is met with respect, where divergence is met with curiosity. And I think that building an environment like that in any research space, but particularly with so many disciplines and thoughts and knowledge coming together, I think that also shows a lot of credit to you and the team for bringing that together. Can I just quickly ask, for those listeners who may not be aware, what is a yan?
Now, when you asked me that question, two things happened. I have a Nigerian African heritage. Maybe you already know that from my accent. And I can tell you what that means. But I live in Australia, and the yan is, so I'll speak to the Australian context. That it's a culturally appropriate way of having a conversation. So there are cultural protocols that you follow through, and there are different types of yans. A yan could be a therapeutic yan, where you understand by observing and following these cultural processes, the conversation will be therapeutic. Some could be a social yan being used for the purposes and the instruments of bonding and deepening relationships, And so you have others may just be, for consensus, building consensus and building shared understanding. So you do have different types of yans, but it's a bit of a celebration of conversation where, you're leaning and bringing yourself and inviting the other person to bring themselves. And it's a culturally appropriate way of doing things. So that in a very strict sense, if I do not belong to that cultural group, it will not be understood that I was having a yan, because I do not understand the cultural nuances or the identity that I can bring to the conversation. So that is what we will call, when in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context, and many other Indigenous contexts, perhaps not restricted to Australia, but then this is where I know, and this is how we will interpret it here.
I love that sentence you use, Yakubu, or a celebration of conversations. I think that's such a nice way of summarizing that, in a way that is respectful, in a way that is, as you say, equitable, to learn and to want to learn and to go to a conversation open-minded, knowing that, at the end of the day, as researchers and as people, we're trying to understand this complexity and understand this world as well as we can, and doing that together, everyone bringing their little grain of sand. I feel that we will get closer to solving some of these problems through open and celebrating conversations rather than oppressing them. Yakubu, I've learned so much from you. It's been fascinating hearing about your experiences, your thoughts, your reflections, your points of contentions, your solutions, or if they're not solutions, in a way, your techniques that you've used. Because most importantly, I think one of the key things that you've shown is the growth and learning that happens in a project like this, and that I think more should be done for this integration of disciplines to come together to try and answer complex problems. But you've been given Easter eggs throughout our conversation, throughout, of different things that you've learned, of different tips, of different learning points that have been fantastic. But I'm going to give you a bit of a challenge now, because at the end of every Realist Lens episode, as you know, we ask for 3 tips that that individuals may want to provide based on their experience and on their thoughts. So the question that I have for you to end is, for researchers embarking on this interdisciplinary projects that combine realist approaches with other traditions, what are your top 3 tips for navigating competing perspectives and sustaining collaboration over time?
That's a good one, Alejandro. I think that the first thing for me is knowing where we are aligned. And so when I was drawing my diagram, there is the Holy Trinity of realism and the way we express ourselves. I was looking for where are the counterpart expressions. They're not, directly translatable, but if I was thinking from an Indigenous research perspective, how would this look like? An Indigenous research person respects, that which is sin, and respects, that which is sacred, and respects, that, ancestors that have gone before them, and things like that. And their research embodies all of that. And I say, hey, we respect that which is real and what is actual, and what is experience, and drawing parallels to that, such that people feel comfortable in the known before you plunge into the unknown, and starting from there. And so just that willingness to do that, to find common grounds and to find common cause is the first tip that I will tell myself. The second tip that I will say is, find what anchors you. If not, you would have a conceptual drift, and your research has a voice. But if you do not have an anchor, if there's not something that is anchoring the creative process of weaving across paradigms, you would lose your voice. So you have to look for an anchor. And so for me, my anchor, was having people who understand my big picture and who were able to tell me, am I drifting from that big picture and that anchor? And the third thing was just realizing that interdisciplinary research takes time. And so you can have timetables, and of course you should work with timetables and you should work with deadlines. But earning trust, it takes time. Learning other people's paradigms takes time. The process of creativity takes time, and allowing for time. Time by itself will not work the magic, but time again is the resource that you need to work the magic. So this will be the 3 things that I will share, Andrew.
Number 1, alignment. Find number 2, what's your anchor? And number 3, take time. And particularly, as you say, in this last one, slow down to speed up, i.e. taking a little bit more time to build those connections, to understand each other, will actually pay off dividends later on in the project and in the future. So, Yakubu, anything else you'd like to share?
Yes, Alejandro, I must also say 2 of your papers I have found as an inspiration, not at the beginning of the process, but somewhere towards the end of the process. The one you wrote on the contributions of complexity science to implementation science, rather realism to implementation science, and the other one on the worked example of linked coding and realist thematic analysis. I think that from the work that you do, Alejandro, you have also demonstrated that it is possible to draw learnings, from other disciplines, and it is possible to use other disciplines to express, the value that critical realism or realism, whether scientific realism as well brings. And I remember especially what you did with the implementation research logic model on the other implementation paper, and where you thought about bringing in the ways that you will articulate mechanisms within that. So I think I've also learned a lot, from you and the podcast and other guests that you've brought in. Maybe it's just an opportunity to say thank you. Thank you too for giving me and many others the opportunity to learn from the work you do.
Well, thank you so much, Yakubu. That's great. And again, this all this work and all these ideas are just the start of, as you say, trying to see how we can develop realist approaches even more within realist approaches, in a more pure, realist approach, but also looking at how we can, get the strengths of different ways of knowing, as we've mentioned, without diluting, which is it is a challenge, and it won't be perfect at all times. But it is about doing that, and of course, anything from the podcast and anything else is to help. I think that's my main driver, just to help as much as I can to as many people. So I'm glad that it's helped you and others in that. You've definitely helped me through this conversation. So thank you so much for your chat, for your time, Yakubu, and for all your real wisdom as you've gone through this process, which is a long time to take a lot of reflections and things. So for anyone listening to the Realist Lens, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you very soon. Yakubu, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alejandro.